Hi, I'm Kev Johnson, Senior Systems Engineer at Runecast Solutions. Just in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about making sure that our hardware is in a good situation in the software-defined world, because even serverless runs on servers. The first thing I really want to highlight here is vSphere7 Update One was released in the not too distant past. It was a couple of months back now, and Update One is typically the release where we see customers starting to take the idea of upgrading to a new version of vSphere really seriously. The problem is, if you've got an environment that looks a little bit like this, whereby you've got maybe hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of servers, how do you know that you're going to be in a good place to do these upgrades? Now, even in smaller environments, it's super important that your hardware is good, is going to be supported, because if it's not supported, you're going to run into problems down the line. So how do we know that our hardware is going to be compatible? Well, firstly, we need to check the VMware Compatibility Guide, or the VMware HCL. And the reason that one of the really important things to bear in mind here is just checking that the server model is supported isn't really enough. You need to check this anyway. Make sure your BIOS is going to be good, is going to be supported. Make sure your processors and everything are good. But particularly, really think about things like I/O devices. So host bus adapters, network cards, anything that's processing I/O. If you've got bad drivers or driver and firmware that clashes, then you're going to have problems. Purple screens of death, bad performance, and troubleshooting those things is going to be a nightmare. So from an I/O devices perspective, what you really need to look at is on the right-hand side of this screen here. So if we look at the vendor ID, the device ID, the sub-vendor ID, these are the things that determine the PCI ID of the device. So this is how we uniquely identify any specific piece of hardware. So we need to make sure that we've got all of that information, and we get that from we can log into the the lights at the ILO or the iDRAC or whatever IPMI device you've got on your server, and you can validate all of this against the HCL. One of the other things to bear in mind once you go to vSphere 7 is that the VMK Linux drivers are no longer available. So it's native drivers only. So if you're using devices that have got VMK Linux drivers, then they're not going to be compatible with vSphere 7. And if you don't do all of this stuff, this is what happens. You get purple screens of death. You get, these are not fun things to have to deal with, because typically all of the servers in your environment are going to be running the same drivers, the same firmware, the same actual hardware. So if you've got a risk there of one of them causing a problem like this, really, you've got a problem with all of them. So we check all of that stuff. It's a lot of work. I like to get a Simpsons meme in where I can. So, what if it could be easier? So obviously, I'm here to tell you there is an easier way of doing it. But one of the things to bear in mind, I actually used to work for VMware. I helped with the building of a feature called vSphere Lifecycle Manager that exists within vSphere 7. And so vSphere 7 can do some of this once you actually get to vSphere 7. But if we take a look at this is just in my lab at home, and we can see this specific ESXi host. It says that hardware compatibility checks are not supported for this current vendor model. Now, I know for a fact that hardware is on the HCL. It's a Supermicro E300 9D 8CN 8TP or something along those lines. So if we look at it in Runecast, we can see actually, yeah, there we go. That hardware is compatible. So you've got that mismatch between what you're seeing within vSphere, within Lifecycle Manager, and bear in mind you have to be running vSphere 7 to get this information. So if you're planning an upgrade to vSphere 7, Lifecycle Manager doesn't help anywhere, and even then, your mileage may vary. And then if we have a look at the I/O devices, so we can see within Runecast that we've got a problem, and this problem is that we've got this firmware here, which is 3.33. Now that firmware is not found in the HCL. We know we've got a problem here. So the driver that I'm running, the i40 EN11090, that's a supported driver, but it requires firmware version 4.11. So I need to upgrade that firmware to be compliant. Now, that may be a minor issue, but when you start talking about I/O devices, these things are super important, because again, you're probably going to have to troubleshoot issues with it at some point in time. So if we then take a look, and we just to validate that Runecast Analyzer isn't actually making this information up, if we look, we can see on the online VMware compatibility guide, we can see that this specific model is supported for ESXi 7 when it's running this specific BIOS. And if I just click back one, we can see we're running this specific BIOS. So we are supported. We just don't have that information showing within the vSphere 7 Lifecycle Manager. One of the other cool things about Runecast Analyzer is we can actually do this across many vCenter servers. So we can see here, for example, we have we've got some hosts here that are not compliant, but we're not just looking at one cluster or one specific host, which you may well have to do with Lifecycle Manager. So we can do it across clusters, we can do it across data centers, we can do it across vCenters, we can do it, the full HCL. So we're not restricted by anything that, whatever information that is already available within Lifecycle Manager. And also we can do it, for version, if you're running ESXi 6, we can still give you this information. We've got full reporting capability, and we're looking at the BIOS, the drivers, and the firmware. So, we're looking at everything that makes up that specific device. Okay, so that's enough with the slideware. So we're just going to swipe across into my lab environment, and we'll have a look in here. So if we go to the hardware compatibility tab, so this is just it's a small lab environment we retain in our offices, and we can see here, for example, across our entire environment, we're checking against the versions of vSphere that we've got installed. So we've got vSphere 6.5 installed here, and we know we've got a problem with this host. And it would appear that it's a PowerEdge R730. They're great servers. It's running the Intel E5 2698, the V4. So again, the supported CPU. It's everything supported for that release of ESXi. However, once we get down to the BIOS level, we can see that we're running this 2.8.0 BIOS, and that 2.8.0 BIOS is not listed. So if we look there, we can see this is our list of supported devices. And then if we want to validate that this is correct, we've actually got a link. We link directly to the VMware Compatibility Guide online. So we can see if we look at this specific server for this release of ESXi, there's a 271 BIOS, but there is no 2.8.0. Just prove that that's the case. So if I just do a search 2.8.0, yeah, we can see down here that it's not supported. Now, if I want to have a look at maybe a different version, so maybe I want to check it against vSphere 7, I can see on vSphere 7, 2.8.0 is a supported BIOS. So we're checking against the specific release. So that's important to understand. If we then have a look at the I/O devices, we can see we've got this problem with this H710P Mini. Now, this is an onboard device. It's built into all of those PowerEdge servers. And we can see here, we're looking at the vendor ID, device ID, all of that information. We can identify that this is an LSI, or it's a rebranded LSI device. It's a Dell PERC H710P Mini. We scroll down here, we can see the driver 691020 is supported. So we're running a supported driver. So that's half of the battle. But then if we look at the minimum firmware, we need to be running firmware 2134, and we're running 2125. Now, if we want to do the same thing for vSAN devices, the vSAN HCL is a bit more stringent than just the regular I/O devices. So we need to make sure we're running the exact driver and firmware combo. So if we look here, we can see 2030, we're running 2030, so the driver's good. We're running firmware 688, and firmware 688 is also on the HCL, so the firmware's good, but they're not qualified together, which means that combination is not supported. So we need to either downgrade this firmware to 660, which would take us in line with the driver that we're running, or we need to upgrade the driver to 2042 at a minimum, which would then bring us in line with the firmware that we're running. Typically, I would recommend upgrading the driver. One other option that we have is we can also upgrade both the driver and the firmware as detailed here, and that would also bring us into compliance. So that's cool when we're dealing with business as usual. We need to make sure that we're removing any risk that's there. But if we're planning these vSphere upgrades, we can come in here and we can run a simulation very quickly. You see how quick that was across all of the entire estate that we have, and we can see where we've got problems. So for example, here we've got problems with an I/O device, which is running a firmware that is unsupported. So that 688 firmware is not supported. And then, the same with the vSAN controls, etc. We've got full export capability, so you can build all kinds of reports there. On that note, I just want to, we'll just wrap up there. So if you're interested in learning more, please go to runecast.com and start a 14-day trial. You can reach us at innovate@runecast.com if you'd like to organize a call with someone like myself or one of my colleagues, or you can tweet us at Runecast, or you can get hold of me. I'm at Kev_Johnson. Thanks very much. Hope to see you again.